In this video, I'm going to show you how to do the color matching exercise. So the first thing you'll need to do is cut out 12 different colors to try to match with your watercolor. I used some paint chips, like paint sample colors for painting walls in my house. I also used colors from magazines. Some of these aren't totally solid, but I'll kind of pick maybe the more saturated color in this case and maybe the middle ground color here. You can use glue stick or staples or tape to put it down. If you use tape, you'll probably want to just do a little roll of tape so that it doesn't get on your watercolor paper, because you'll need the area around for painting a matching color swatch. So I'll start over here with this dark grayish blue, and what you want to do is assess whether, like, what color in your palette is closest to the color that you're trying to make. And I think that the Prussian blue is closer to this color than the ultramarine blue, so it might make sense to start with the Prussian. So I'm going to get a little bit of Prussian blue in my palette. But I also think that maybe this blue is kind of neutral, so I might be able to put some ultramarine in it too, and that might calm down that more kind of cyan quality to the Prussian blue. And if you have a white palette, you can swirl your paint around and look at it when it's thin, and that will kind of give you a sense of what it'll look like. But you'll probably also just have to test it right onto your paper. And then also remember that your colors are going to look more vibrant and dark when they're first laid down and when they're wet. And then when they dry, they'll usually lighten and become more dull. And so you might need to overcompensate, making your color a little bit more vibrant than you think it needs to be. Okay, so this blue is a little bit grayish, and so I need to neutralize the blue a little bit. So generally you can do that by putting a complement in. I might actually just put a little bit of brown in and see what happens. It's gonna go a little bit more green, and if it goes too green, which I think it has, then I can neutralize that with some alizarin crimson, and it'll go a little bit more gray. Now that's looking a little closer, but maybe it's a little too gray. I'm gonna add a little blue back into it. Now I kind of like this. This is looking pretty good. If I'm feeling pretty confident, I could go right in and make a matching swatch. But if not, I might just want to test it nearby somewhere. And maybe you won't even want to adhere your paint color or your kind of color chips down initially, because you then you can kind of put them right up against the color that you've tested and see how that looks. Now I suspect that this color will dry a little bit grayer than it is now, and so it might match pretty well, but I do sense now that it's painted down that maybe it could be a little bit more purple. And so if I add the tiniest bit of red to it, I think that that's closer to the color that I want. And while this is wet, I have the opportunity to put that in. And if I squint at it, I think the colors are pretty similar. And I also think that this will dry a little bit lighter, and it should be pretty comparable. If it was too dark, I could go in and actually blot it up. And so you could find like a clean spot on your paper towel or cloth and get a fresh one. And then you could just kind of cleanly blot up the color. And this isn't so dark that I would want to do that, but it might just be dark enough that I should pick up a little bit of that pigment with my brush. And maybe that will be a little bit better in terms of a value match, now that I'm looking at it again. Okay, so next I'm going to do this olive green. So how do we make green? We mix yellow and blue together. My sense is that this is more related to yellow ochre in terms of the green. And so I might start with my yellow ochre to get that. I happen to have some kind of green, muddy green over here in my palette, and I'm just adding some yellow ochre to it. And looking at my color here, I think it could go a little bit yellower. Now that feels like a pretty close match to me. Looks a little green on my paper relative to how it looks in the palette. So I might dilute it a hair and put just a little bit more yellow in it. And I'd like for your colors to be about 1 inch, again, just so you can really see the color well. So I think this is a little dark, and I'm gonna pull a little bit of pigment back out of it to get closer value to that same color. And then I'll have to wait for it to dry. It's a little bit green. It might need a little bit of yellow. One way I could potentially make it even closer is by glazing over it with a tiny bit of yellow later once it's dry. But first I'm gonna see how it pans out. Okay, so next here I have this kind of very light mauve, like a grayish purple. So I'm gonna need to have a really dilute color to get that light value. I just put some water in my palette over here, and it's a little bit gray already. It was over near my Prussian blue. And so if I add a little alizarin crimson to that, it's gonna go toward that department there. Now this might still be a little light. Let's see, but I can check it out and see. I'm gonna put a teeny bit more blue in it. I think that'll give it, put it a little closer to that color. Okay, so I added a tiny bit more blue and now it's pretty close. I added the ultramarine blue. And again, it's gonna dry a little lighter, so I'm not sure I wanna pull out any pigment there. It's darker right now, but I suspect it'll dry pretty comparably. Now, if you go back and look at my colors from before, they're drying pretty close to what I was trying to match. So that's encouraging. Maybe I'll pick up just a little bit of pigment right there with my brush being thirsty. Okay, maybe I'll mix a warm color here for you, and then I'll speed it up and you can watch me mix the rest that way. So this is a pretty vibrant red. I'm thinking I'm gonna need to mix my cadmium red with my more magenta, the alizarin crimson, to get something that color. Now the problem with the cadmium is it's kind of orangey, so it's almost like it's red with some yellow mixed into it. And that means when you mix it with some other colors, so yellow and purple are complements, right? So if you mix yellow into purple, it's going to go brown. And so if I'm mixing the cadmium, thinking, oh, if I mix red and purple together, it'll just make a red purple. Well, actually, if it's got some yellow mixed into it already, then it's going to make that color more muddy. And so you want to be careful with that. Okay, so I have a color that I think is pretty close here. It's a little dark right now, but I think it'll... Now it's also a little red. I think it could be a hair pinker. So I'm gonna put a little more alizarin crimson into it. And in this case, I just decided to mix right into the swatch that I'm painting. Everything's still wet, and so I can just change that color slightly. And then this will dry a little bit more dull, and at that point it'll probably match this red right here. Okay, so you'll go through and you will paint matching colors for each of your 12. Now I'm working on this rosy color here. You can see I've laid it down and it's a little too yellow, not quite vibrant enough. So I tried putting the alizarin crimson in because that's the closest I have to a pink, but it doesn't have the right quality to it, and I noticed that it's more purple. So I add a little bit of ultramarine to balance it out, and now the color is definitely closer, but it still has a little bit of a grayer quality to it. Now, I want you to keep in mind that you are limited in your color mixing to some extent based on the primary colors in your palette. So we actually do have this rose, opera rose color, which if I had used it would have allowed me to make that pink much more easily, but I was keeping it to the primary 7 colors in your palette just for the sake of the exercise. It's good for you to learn how to mix colors to the best of your ability with the colors in your palette before going out and buying a tube of every color imaginable. That said, there are a wide variety of primary colors that you can get, and if you use those for mixing, you will arrive at different destinations color-wise. So sometimes you will find a color swatch that you simply cannot make. This is especially the case with fluorescent colors. We just can't reproduce the hotness of those colors unless we get like a really hot watercolor to start with, or gouache. Now, this color up above that's kind of airy beige, it was really an accurate color the first time I laid it in, but then I wanted it to be a little bit darker. And colors like this are actually pretty tricky because they're so nuanced and every amount you add in ends up being too strong. So here you can see it went too gray and it needs to go back toward that slightly more beigey green. So I'm pulling some of that pigment back out again. And that color doesn't look as great of a match as I would like, but it is going to dry a little bit lighter. We'll see how it pans out in a little while. Once you have finished matching all 12 of your color swatches, then I'd like for you to go through and write words that you associate with each of these colors. Try to avoid the most obvious words that are usually used as the name for the color, and err on the side of words that are more emotional or personal or remind you of things out in the world. And then once you've come up with 3 associations for each color, that is the end of that exercise.